Welcome to the first supplemental WES case. These WES cases will be available to the staff every few months for everyone to work through. These cases are supplemental and additional to the regularly scheduled early spring cases provided by George. Before, during, and after the case, be sure to fill out the job sheet questions, which have been designed to exercise all aspects of a typical severe weather event. This particular event takes place on April 29, 2010. Although I'll address a few synoptic and mesoscale aspects of this system, feel free to look through your own severe weather procedures to come up with your assessment of the environment. Alright, let's get started. You are the R shift for the Topeka CWA on April 29, 2010. You have arrived for your briefing at 3:45 on a Wednesday afternoon. Current staffing is as follows: 2 I shift forecasters, 1 O shift HMT intern, 1 Q shift, and all 3 managers. Of course, the I shift, MIC, and WCM are scheduled to leave at 4 p.m. with the SU scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m. Taking a look at the synoptic scale setup, we will begin with the water vapor imagery. Taking a look at the water vapor imagery along with the NAM 80 500 millibar pressure heights, we can see a fairly potent mid to upper level wave over the eastern Montana plains. Over the southern and central plains, strong southwest flow aloft is present with a couple lobes of energy apparent in the 500 millibar pressure field. The expectation through the remainder of the afternoon is that one of these lobes of energy will eject through central Kansas, kicking off a round of thunderstorms across the far western portion of the CWA. As we can see from this loop, a few of the storms have already fired across north central Kansas and are moving into south central Nebraska. The red line indicates roughly where the shortwave trough axis is located, approximately 0Z. Now we'll look at an overview of the RUC 40 for this event. At the surface, indicated by the thick blue lines, there is an elongated surface trough extending as far north as the Minnesota Prairie, with a broad warm sector stretching northward into northern Iowa. The blue wind barbs show off the southerly flow, which is roughly out of the south, with a hint of southwesterly component to around 22Z. By 23Z and 0Z, we can see that the surface winds are expected to back slightly to a more south-southeasterly component, with good surface convergence at the triple point near Great Bend and along the cold front, which stretches from roughly the extreme southeast corner of Colorado northeastward to Norfolk, Nebraska. By 0-1 and 0-2Z, we see that the model is breaking out convection along the previously mentioned convergence zone. A quick look at the upper level 300 millibar winds indicates that a strong jet streak is nosing into the northern plains just west of the surface convergence zone where convection is expected to take place. Although the area ripe for convection is not located directly under the jet streak, it is located under the right exit region, which is generally favorable for subsidence and perhaps some convective suppression. But as we saw from the RUC output on the previous slide, it does look as though convection will indeed take place, but perhaps could be isolated or scattered in nature. To finish off our look at the synoptic scale setup for this event, we'll look briefly at the 500 millibar vorticity chart. Stepping through the vorticity time series, we see that the previously mentioned and identified lobe of energy embedded within the strong southwesterly flow will create a vortmax over the previously identified area for convective initiation. This vortmax will likely bring enough mid-level support to kick off thunderstorms over central and north central Kansas later this afternoon. Moving on to the mesoscale influences for our April 29th event. First, we'll look at the surface map along with observations and visible imagery. As was mentioned previously, a broad warm sector is present within the strong southerly surface flow. The warm and moist sector seemingly extends all the way north to at least northern Iowa, with most of the CWA in the 80s with mid to upper 50-degree dew points. At 22Z, we can clearly see the cold front sagging into north central Kansas, with some convection initiating along the leading edge. At 23Z, convection is now ongoing in north central Kansas along the cold front, and to the southwest of the CWA we can see a pretty clear dry line with a triple point near Great Bend and a decent heat axis punching into that triple point. The sounding taken near Minneapolis, Kansas at 0Z indicates pretty steep lapse rates in the lowest 1 to 2 kilometers with a decent amount of CAPE, approximately 2100 joules per kilogram. Given the fairly significant temperature dew point depression in the low levels and at the surface, we are left with LCLs around 6,000 feet, a little high to consider tornadic activity a widespread threat. But given the ample instability and impressive shear profile indicated by the veering and increasing winds with height, it does look like supercells will be very possible with large hail and damaging winds. The associated hodograph to the previous sounding shows off a tremendous amount of low-level shear and subsequent low-level storm relative helicity. Although there is a good amount of helicity, there isn't a strong looping shape to the hodograph typically associated with strong to violent tornadoes. It does demonstrate a rather straight structure to it, though, which may indicate the potential for splitting supercells. Quickly, we'll take a look at the low-level jet at 850 millibars for this event. As the day progresses, we see that the 850 winds will keep a southerly direction to it, but will increase to around 40 to 50 knots by 0Z. This increase in low-level winds will help increase the low-level wind shear and associated low-level SRH as the evening progresses. Let's now look at how the low-level shear responds to that wind field. We can see a steady increase in low-level wind shear throughout the day, starting around 200 meters squared per second squared at 22Z, increasing to 400 meters squared per second squared in our western zones by 0Z, and even increasing to around 500 meters squared per second squared at around 1Z. Of course, by this time we may be dealing with low-level decoupling, so storms may or may not be surface-based by the time the low-level wind shear reaches these incredible values. Now we'll look at the overall Cape-shear relationship for this event. As expected from the sounding, we have ample surface-based instability by 22Z. As we move along in time, we see the Cape bullseye stretches northward with better surface heating and decent moisture into north-central Kansas. By 0Z, we can see good instability to our west with good surface-based instability along the cold front, with exception to an area near Washington and Marshall counties where SB Cape may be subdued from models resolving ongoing convection. Obviously, with all of these slides, we can see that the deep layer shear indicated by the orange vectors is very strong. 0 to 6 kilometer shear approaches 80 knots in some areas where convection is likely to take place. Again, given this strong cape and shear environment, it would not be unreasonable to expect some of the convection to morph into supercells. Quickly, we'll look at the sin associated with this event. As we move through the day, we see a relative minimum of sin taking place around 23 to 0Z, with 20 to 40 joules per kilogram of inhibition left over, although we do not completely eradicate the surface-based sin during the height of the event. As we saw in the sounding LCLs, look to be pretty high for this event, so let's look at the surface TD depression and LCL heights. Early during the event and in the late afternoon, we see that the temperature dew point spread is on the order of 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. These high dew point depressions will act to keep LCLs high and should act as a mitigating factor for strong tornadoes. Of course, by 0Z, we can see that the TTD spread has come down quite a bit, but again, that could be a factor of low-level cooling and decoupling or because of ongoing convection. The associated LCL heights are pretty close to what the sounding showed earlier, where expected LCLs will be in the 4,500 to 6,000 foot range throughout the event, with perhaps a decrease in LCL heights after dark. By 1Z, there is a local LCL minimum across Republic and Washington counties, but this again may be in response to the convective initiation. Unpictured are the 0 to 1 kilometer shear vectors, but given that they are in the order of 30 to 40 knots throughout this event, and given the range of expected LCLs, this diagram submitted by Jeff Craven and Harold Brooks in 2002 shows off general expectations for the tornadic threat for this type of setup. Indicated in the red oval is the approximate shear LCL height relation for our storms this afternoon. The numbers in the boxes represent a general probability of tornado occurrence, and for this case it's residing in the mid-20 to lower 30% range. Now that we've analyzed the mesoscale environment, we'll take a look at the expected supercell motion using Bunker's left and right storm motion. Referring back to our hodograph taken at 0Z, we saw that ample shear was available for supercellular activity, but given the general straight shape of the hodograph, it's possible that any supercell activity could result in left and right splits. As we step through the period of storm activity for this event, there is little change in the general right and left moving storm vectors with time. Right moving supercells should generally move northeast around 35 to 40 knots, with left movers generally shooting off to the north-northeast at 50 to 55 knots. And just for fun, we'll look at an index that may or may not come in handy on some days. The Energy Helicity Index actually combines CAPE and low-level SRH to formulate an index that is supposed to convey severe weather threat on a given day. Usually anything over 2 indicates a good chance for severe weather with some tornadic activity. It's assuming storms initiate, of course. But as we step through the day, starting at 23Z and going through 1Z, we can see that our area reaches a 3 to 5 range for EHI. It's strong CAPE shear relationship across southern and central Kansas is causing EHI to spike, but capping issues will likely preclude convection in this area. The mesoscale discussion has been issued at 3:49 p.m. and may or may not shed much light on this scenario. The area of the MCD highlights our northern zones, and the text is rather vague. Perhaps the most important part of the discussion is highlighted at the end, where SPC indicates that the LCL heights may actually limit the tornadic potential. By the time you start this case, the first initial convection will be ongoing. Disorganized cellular activity will be ongoing in the northern zones and should have moved out of the forecast area before your case begins. The case will run from 23Z until 1Z, and you'll be sectored within the area enclosed by the yellow line. Before starting, however, please fill out the job sheet questions 1 through 3. These questions are designed to exercise decision points expected before convection takes place. You'll be asked what type of hazard you expect, how you'll handle SPC coordination, and with respect to the potential watch, and how you'd handle staffing. The last 2 questions will be filled out post-event and will address decision points with respect to warning operations and a feedback question to improve future cases. When you're ready to go and have looked at the synoptic and mesoscale environment and filled out the job sheet, you can resume the case and pick up warning on storms starting at 23Z going through 1Z.